When wealth stops impressing and starts controlling, there comes a moment when wealth loses its ability to shock. Numbers no longer impress, luxury no longer persuades, and display no longer delivers advantage. That moment changes everything. Because when wealth stops inspiring admiration, it must evolve or become irrelevant. Among the world's most powerful sheiks, that evolution has already happened. To understand why this shift matters today, we need to confront a hard truth. Most people believe wealth works through desire, through envy, through aspiration, but desire fades quickly. Once excess becomes familiar, it loses influence. Once luxury becomes common, it stops commanding attention. The sheiks saw this coming. They watched how audiences adapted, how spectacle became content, how outrage turned into entertainment, and how admiration dissolved into indifference. At that point, wealth faced a choice: remain visible and be ignored, or become invisible and effective. Control offered the answer. Wealth stopped trying to be liked. It stopped trying to be understood. It stopped trying to be admired. Instead, it repositioned itself as infrastructure. Access to capital became leverage. Ownership of systems became authority. Influence embedded itself into process. This was not dramatic. It was subtle, and that subtlety made it permanent. When wealth operates quietly, people adjust behavior without noticing why. Rules feel natural. Outcomes feel inevitable. This is the difference. Impressive wealth excites reaction. Controlling wealth shapes options. And once options are shaped, choice becomes an illusion. This transition marked a turning point because power no longer needed to convince. It only needed to constrain. But control invites resistance. When people sense influence without visibility, they search for its source. They question legitimacy. They test boundaries. And that tension is where the real conflict begins. Because once wealth starts controlling, it cannot return to being admired. And what follows is a new form of power that very few are prepared to recognize. At first, control felt accidental. Outcomes aligned too easily. Barriers appeared without explanation. Opportunities narrowed quietly. People adjusted without protest. They assumed coincidence. They blamed markets. They blamed timing. But patterns do not remain invisible forever. As wealth embedded itself into systems, control stopped announcing itself. It no longer needed symbols. It relied on structure. Capital flowed through predefined channels. Access required alignment. Participation depended on permission. Nothing felt forced. Nothing felt imposed. That was a genius. When control feels natural, resistance never organizes. There is nothing obvious to oppose. Wealth learned to operate upstream, before regulation, before debate, before reaction. By the time decisions surfaced, alternatives had already vanished. This is how control replaced admiration. No one needed to be impressed when outcomes were already shaped. But this subtlety created unease, because control without visibility raises uncomfortable questions. Who decides? Who benefits? Who is excluded? As these questions grew louder, the pressure to reveal increased. Critics demanded transparency. Institutions demanded accountability. The public demanded explanation. Yet explanation would weaken control. Visibility would invite interference. Debate would slow outcomes. Negotiation would redistribute leverage. So wealth responded carefully. It offered participation without influence, choice without impact, visibility without access. People could see more, but change less. This created a new kind of frustration, because when power cannot be located, it cannot be challenged directly. When systems feel closed, anger looks for symbols, and symbols attract attention. The moment wealth began controlling, it became a target, not because it was visible, but because it was effective. That effectiveness now carried risk, because control, once felt, is never tolerated indefinitely. And what followed was not rebellion. It was probing, a search for leverage, inside a system designed to reveal nothing. The probing began quietly. Small challenges, isolated disruptions, attempts to locate pressure points. At first, nothing moved. Regulations changed, but outcomes stayed the same. Public criticism intensified, but access did not expand. Investigations produced visibility, not leverage. This was unsettling, because it suggested that control no longer lived. Where scrutiny was applied, wealth had anticipated exposure. It had designed systems that could absorb it. When one channel closed, another opened. When one structure faced limits, another carried influence. Control rerouted itself seamlessly. This adaptability frustrated challengers. Every attempt to constrain power only revealed how distributed it had become. There was no single center to confront, no clear authority to pressure. Control was everywhere, and nowhere at once. This forced a realization. Traditional resistance relies on visibility, on names, on symbols, on identifiable decision-makers. But controlling wealth had removed those anchors. It operated through incentives, not commands, through defaults, not directives. People complied because alternatives disappeared, not because they were forced. That made resistance costly. Challengers risked exclusion without proof of wrongdoing. Critics faced barriers without explanation. Opposition dissolved into isolation. This was the peak of tension. Control had become efficient, but also brittle, because systems that shape behavior invisibly depend on continued trust in inevitability. Once people believe alternatives exist, the illusion weakens. Inside elite circles, this risk was understood. Control could not tighten indefinitely. Pressure had to be released carefully. Flexibility had to remain visible enough to prevent revolt. The question was no longer whether wealth could control, it was how much control could be exercised before resistance organized in new forms. And that answer would define the future of power itself. The climax did not arrive through collapse. It arrived through calibration. Wealth did not tighten control further. It relaxed it just enough. Access widened selectively. Alternatives appeared, but remained constrained. Choice was reintroduced, but only within boundaries already set. This was the final evolution. Control no longer needed to feel absolute. It only needed to feel unavoidable. By allowing limited flexibility, the system released pressure without losing authority. People felt movement. They felt agency. But outcomes stayed consistent. That was the mastery. When wealth controls invisibly, the greatest risk is awakening resistance. So power learned to appear permissive, while remaining decisive. This reframing dissolved tension. Critics lost focus. Opposition fragmented. Momentum faded. Because resistance struggles when there is no clear wall to push against. The revelation is uncomfortable. The most advanced form of power does not dominate loudly. It does not restrict openly. It does not defend itself aggressively. It adjusts environments. So behavior aligns naturally. When wealth reaches this stage, it no longer needs admiration. It does not need fear. It does not even need obedience. It needs participation, because participation sustains systems far longer than force ever could. This is where modern power now lives, not in spectacle, not in secrecy, but in design. Design of incentives, design of access, design of reality itself. The resolution is clear. Wealth stops being impressive the moment it becomes structural. And once it becomes structural, removing it feels impossible without dismantling everything around it. That is why control, once established, rarely looks like control. It feels like normality. And normality is the most stable form of power ever created. Because when people stop noticing influence, they stop resisting it. When